A new study came out that said if your heart rate is more than 75 beats per minute, you might be at risk for sudden death. But is that hope or hype? I'm Dr. G, and we'll break that down coming up at 5.
Well, I read that, and it scared me. So I took the study to Dr. Verinder Mathur, a cardiologist at the St. Luke's Heart Institute. Well, his initial response:
do not panic, even if your pulse is 80.
That's because when he broke the study down for us, of the 5,713 men tracked over a 23-year period, 81 died of sudden death. Granted, the average resting pulse rate of this group was higher, but when you work the numbers, that turns out to be less than 1%.
If you're healthy, you're exercising, and you see some change,
it is a very important clue to go and get checked.
So is his story hope or hype? Well, Dr. Mathur took my resting heart rate just to be sure.
I'm sorry to tell you, Pawan, he's 88.
So what does that mean? Should I panic? Am I going to die?
No, that's the whole point. That if your pulse is more than 75, it doesn't mean a thing.
Are you sure your watch is working? Maybe you should check it again.
Increase of these procedures, C-sections.
Well, you know, the facts about the increase in C-section is not surprising, but it's quite dramatic. I mean, it's almost twice than what the WHO recommends, which is around 15%. But there's a lot of different factors that go into this. You know, there's things like obesity. The states that have the highest obesity rates tend to have also the highest rate of C-sections. There's things related to scheduling. And I think the overall atmosphere for C-sections is...
Is there another explanation to what happened to him?
Well, some scientists believe that this is just a physiological response. It's a lack of oxygen to the brain which causes a near-death experience.
Houston Dr. Pavan Grover has been fascinated with near-death experiences for years.
Scientists have actually stimulated a part of the brain and been able to recreate a near-death experience. People seeing light, having kind of a life review.
But he says medicine can't account for everything these patients see.
What these scientists can't explain is how people, when they die and they have an out-of-body experience and they can describe what's happening like half across the hospital, and there's no way that they could know that experience, which is what this is why it's so intriguing.
Yeah, well, you know, a lot of people too who've had the near-death experiences, they might envision what they think of heaven is like, or like the light at the end of the tunnel. They might see gates or flowers. If there was a scientific reasoning for this, what would you?
Well, there isn't a scientific reason. Like I said, the out-of-body experience, the common things like this have been described since the Egyptians, actually. There's a book called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was 300 years before Christ. And they actually described all these things in detail. So throughout history, this has been a documented experience. So it's quite fascinating. The medical evidence stuff, which they can't explain, again, is being able to see things, you know, and the only way they can explain that is if somebody actually had an out-of-body experience to be able to describe some of these things. We're totally intrigued by that.
You know, describe some of the instances that you've seen personally in your own practice.
Well, hopefully in my practice today, there's a lot of people experiencing that. But when I was a resident in training, I used to work at Herman Hospital, and we did a lot of trauma. And those rotations, the way the trauma rooms are set up is like 4 or 5 rooms next to each other, but all, you know, blocked off. And we'd have all these patients that would come in from car accidents. We'd have to resuscitate one, get them resuscitated, go into the next room. It was quite, you know, intense sort of situation. And the next day, some of the patients would describe this experience of seeing a tunnel and a light, but then they could describe what was happening in the trauma rooms and on them, which was fascinating because that's not anything they could have known or even overheard. And I got that experience from so many different patients that was quite intriguing and not anything that we could explain.
Yeah, certainly. And does this usually happen with trauma patients?
Well, anybody because in trauma patients are coming in and they're, you know, in shock, or they go through cardiac arrest. So in trauma, of course, you're going to see a lot more of that because you have to bring them back on an immediate basis. And now that we've gotten so sophisticated with bringing patients back, we're seeing more and more of these kind of experiences with patients.
All right. So
and what's really interesting is when they come back, the change that they have. I mean, they come back, they have no more fear of death. I mean, it's a very profound change in their life. They're not as worried about dying. They have more of a, you know, like love for their family or the thirst for knowledge. I mean, I think it's a lot more we still have to learn, but it's quite a fascinating topic.
And a love for God, too, which is very interesting you bring that point up. It's almost like they have no fear of death because they've seen what it's like on the other side. All right, cool. Thanks for coming in,
You're
Doctor.
welcome.
Jose, back to you.
Well, you might remember about a month ago, a widely hyped study from the CDC that said if you're overweight, you're not at greater risk of dying than people of normal weight.
And I remember this, Dr. G, because you said that was wrong, and guess what? Now the government is agreeing with you. So let's take another look at what you said.
It's definitely hype because bottom line, forgive the pun, the study did not say that being overweight will make you live longer or healthier. But a lot of groups like Consumer Freedom are spreading this misinformation, and that's doing more harm than good. Yeah, I went on to tease Bill about his fondness for Whataburgers. He went out and got one right away. But in all seriousness, the head of the CDC now says that she's sorry for the misleading data. If the test is negative, there's less than a 1% chance of the baby being delivered prematurely. If positive, doctors can take action so that the baby doesn't end up here.
Local 2 medical expert Dr. G did not treat Shoemaker and doesn't know specifically about her diagnosis, but says...
Now, thank you for joining us, Dr. G.
You're welcome.
We are told that...
Whether or not Terry Schiavo is getting them has become something of an issue in this case.
Again, Dr. G.
You're welcome.
Jennings is having chemotherapy right away. What does that suggest to you?
Dr. G, you touched on this in your report. Now, the FDA has the power to control prescription drugs, but why not something like ephedra that was sold over the counter and has been linked to so many health problems?
Well, Bill, here's the deal. Now, the federal laws are different for supplements. For example, in prescription drugs, the burden of the proof is on the manufacturer to show that the drug is safe. However, in this case, for supplements, the burden of proof is on the FDA to show that a drug is harmful. To show you how big of a hurdle that can be, the FDA looked at peer-reviewed studies, they looked at reports of injuries, and even about 150 deaths. But even then, the ruling was upturned. Besides the health benefits, the kids say it's a lot of fun too.
In the short time I spent with the kids, it was obvious that they all wanted to be there, and each was confident and had a strong sense of identity.
So, Bill, you can't go for that extra cheeseburger.
Oh, man. I thought I was home free this
I'm going to
time.
have to be the food Nazi here. No cheeseburger.
One day they have this study, the next day it's this study, and I was banking on this stuff.
Yeah. I know
Bottom
you were
line,
happy
no
about that.
food for you,
All right.
no cheeseburger for you.
No
cheeseburger. Scientists who studied prairie dogs, and they looked at the sex life of prairie dogs. Why they were looking at the sex life of prairie dogs, I don't know. But their mother must have been proud. But what they found was that in prairie dogs, when they mated, they released 2 chemicals, vasopressin and oxytocin, and those 2 chemicals were responsible for them staying together. Similar in humans, and when they gave them chemicals that blocked it, they found that they couldn't be together. So,
threatening injury. One of Houston's top local pain management specialists, Dr. Pavan Grover, explained to us just a little while ago the most common course of treatment for Yao.
put a boot on him first, immobilize him, get him off his weight, and wait 6 to 8 weeks and see if it, if it heals. If it doesn't, then they have to consider a surgical option. Now that's either going to be putting in more pins like he's had to stabilize that bone. So when you put pins in, it kind of strengthens it. Putting in a bone graft, or actually changing the structure of how the foot works. So instead of having an arch, they can make it more flatter so that when he lands on it, the stress point is not on that same area, but a different area.